recording? Okay. Alright, I'd like to start off with blanket thank yous. I'm really happy that everybody can come together and be here. Debate's really fun, and anytime I can get a little debate in is always fine by me. So, with that said, we're going to go up to the top of the case. The resolution given to us today reads, resolved, Batman is dead. Me and my partner, Abby, have tried to clarify this round by giving some interpretations of the definitions as given. For Batman, we have defined Batman as activism, but activism specifically that focuses around risking yourself and your safety and turning this activism into a lifestyle. So we're talking about lifestyle, safety-risking activism, which is totally what Batman is. He's a Bruce Wayne believing in justice and doing what he has to do, so he puts on a cowl and beats up bad guys. Is defining this as a fact round, is a verb of being, so Batman is something, he exists in some form or another, therefore it's an observation. And then dead, we're going to leave as dead. Dead is no longer living, it's dead, it's not in a positive position, it's in a negative position. And then we're going to narrow the round down to talking about activism in America. We're talking about America specifically because we all have a frame of reference there. The weighing mechanism today is more true than false, so whichever side is able to most prove that they are speaking the truth, then they win. Going on to contention one, the criteria. The criteria given to, or that we're going to outline today, are ways that you can judge whether or not activism is or is not dead. If activism meets these criteria, therefore it is therefore dead. So big A under criteria is no new growth. If something is dead, it is not growing. Because it's dead, it is unable to grow. So there is no new growth. And big B under criteria is loss of soul. In sort of a religious context, we can understand this as when you die, your soul goes off somewhere else. When something is dead, its internal philosophy is stopped. It has lost its core value. It's no longer alive. It is dead. Going on to contention two, the application. In the application, we like to take the premise, the observation that Batman or activism is dead, and we're applying it to the criteria and looking at the real world. So what is the application of these criteria to the real world? Big A, activism is not growing. Little one is the generations have shifted. Little A, the old generation has accomplished its goals and therefore thinks that there's no reason to go on. Many people of past generations believe that because they accomplished their goals of getting specific rights for themselves, that we live in a post-racial society. Many of these people are not looking to the future and thinking about growth. They're on their way out, and many of them understand this. Little b under this is that the millennial generation is not filling in their shoes. The millennial generation is not interested in the same kinds of activism and simply does not have the same level of involvement to fill the types of activism we used to see. They are not self-risking, they do not risk their safety, and it is not a lifestyle for them. Rather, they view it as an activity. So they are not activists in their everyday life. It is not their lifestyle to be active in a cause. Rather, they are weekend activists. On their free time, they do this or that. Maybe they go to a gay pride parade, and that's wonderful, but their lives are not invested in that fight. Little 2 under big A is a lack of unity. This generally outlines the idea that groups are splintering into ever-dividing factions. Instead of unifying in the way that they did during the 1960 Civil Rights Movement to get a specific goal passed, each individual group, whether defined by their philosophical, political beliefs or by their ethnic backgrounds, wants to get their rights passed. They want to do what's best for them. A great example of this is specifically looking into the LGBT activism sort of phenomena. People widely believe that it fights for the rights of all sorts of sexual minorities, but there have been several times where gay activist leaders have made fun of and called out asexual people for joining in their parades and in their activities because they don't believe that they have the same kind of rights. Yes?
Can you give an example of that?
Mark Savage, or Matt Savage, the Savage guy, I forget his last name, or his first name, specifically criticizing them in 2008 in a California rally, saying that they have nothing to complain about because no one's oppressing them. It's this kind of idea. It's sort of, I'm all in it for myself and I'm fighting for my people, not all people. Going on to big B, activism has lost soul. Little one, slacktivism. Big A, Facebook likes. People believe that by liking something, by giving it attention, is the same thing as acting out and doing things. But simply put, that is not the same kind of activism. That is activism as an activity, but not activism as a lifestyle. Little b under this is the idea of Twitter hashtags, like hashtag Black Lives Matter. Many of those photos that people posted are of them smiling with pictures. It's all about them trying to join in the cause, but they're not actually doing anything about it. They're just smiling in pictures and holding up hashtags and annoying people on the internet. That's not the same kind of activism that we used to see. Little 2 under big B is attention seeking. Little a under this is Paine 2012, which was entirely inaccurate and all for the attention of the people involved in it and the attention of the people leading the movement. And little b under this is the idea of Tumblrinas. These are people that get on Tumblr and try to make up new sexual identities for themselves and claim that they're this or that. They're not actually doing it in a way to further the cause of LGBT rights. They're not pressuring congressmen to make decisions. They're just simply talking about themselves. For all these reasons, I urge a government ballot. You keep it recording the whole time, right?
Okay, is everybody ready? Okay, I'd like to start out with a quick round of thank yous. Thank you to the government team for constructing an enjoyable case today. I wish we had debated about Batman, but I can live without it. Thanks to Carter Carolyn, who I always enjoy debating alongside, and thank you to the person filming us. Alright, so with all this in mind, I'm going to start off by addressing definitions, move down towards the rest of the top of the case, and then moving to contention 1 and contention 2. So, to begin, the definitions for the round, the resolution was Batman is dead. They redefined Batman as activism focused around risking safety and overall in terms of a lifestyle. So essentially, people have to risk their lives regularly in a lifestyle to encapsulate activism. And secondly, is dead, no longer living, kind of face value. We'll accept these definitions. However, I want you to hold them to the notion of is dead, no longer living. When we talk about something being dead, that means it is done. It no longer exists. There's not one instance of it existing. There's not one breath or heartbeat out there. And at the end of the day, it can't come back to life either. And as we will show through the remainder of our case, there is a clear indicator that activism in their definition does still exist in some respects and still has the potential to reemerge in the future. Therefore, under their own definitions, the government should lose this round. Moving down, they talk about exclusively activism in America, that's fine. And secondly, they talk about more true than false. We'll go around to that. So with all of this in mind, we'll move down into their contentions. Contention 1 criteria. First, they talk about no new growth, big A. So essentially, they're telling us that there isn't any new growth in activism and something being dead at the end of the day. However, when we look about something being dead, it can't just be that there's no new growth. It means that there has to be an entire cutoff on the potential for growth moving forward. If something is dead, that means that it can't come back to life in the future. That can't just be no new growth right now, but there needs to be no potential whatsoever for new growth in the future. Yes?
Is there a likelihood to revive dead things?
No, which is why activism is not dead, because there's a perfectly good reasonability for it to be revived in the future. So when we're talking about no new growth, there's still the very real possibility for something to come back at the end, and activism in the end of the day will. B, loss of soul. They're talking about the idea that they don't have the same intentions that they don't have, that there's no longer any willingness to embrace those same values that existed in the past. As we'll show you, this criteria does not, as well as the criteria A, This criteria also does not apply to activism, therefore will indicate why activism is not dead. So, moving on to the applications. Big A, activism is not growing. Little 1, they talk about generations are shifting. Little A, they talk about old generations have achieved their goals. Essentially, they say that they believe in a post-racial society and no longer feel like they have to do anything. Yes?
I'm sorry, can you go back down over your response to contention 1, big B, loss of soul?
So, loss of soul, I essentially just said that I'm illustrating my refutation at this point, how, regardless of whether or not that criteria does reflect something being dead or not, it doesn't apply to activism, therefore activism is not dead in the sense that you bring up. So, back down to where I was, they talk about how the old generation has moved on. They're no longer interested in what's going on. They're done being activists because they've already accomplished their goals. However, this simply is not the case. First of all, we need to recognize that activism can indeed be fragmented at the end of the day. There can be those who are no longer quite as interested as they were in the first place, but are still active in risking their lives in a regular area in order to achieve their goals. When they state that all of these people in this generation no longer are interested in the same goals that they were fighting for perhaps back in the 1970s or beforehand, that's such a massive generalization that it cannot be proven as fact. Just recognize the fact that some of the same protesters to the Vietnam War have been protesting against the involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan and in the Middle East. These are still activist goals, which these people are going out in dangerous rallies, fighting against what in many cases can be police brutality or government oppression, in an effort to overcome clear risks to their safety to try and indicate that they still support their cause. If we can assume that there is even one person out there like this, then activism in the sense that they define is not dead and cannot be dead. Secondly, looking to 1B, millennials are not interested. They talk about how we're casual, we're not really invested. But there is a plethora of examples that indicate that this simply is not the case. I can bring up 2 off the top of my head. 1, Ferguson. Involvement in Ferguson was a hugely dangerous protest ground to be participating in. And the activism against a white police officer killing a black man who many considered to be unarmed and killed in cold blood, essentially, many of the protesters who traveled to Ferguson, as well as those who already were in Ferguson, were fighting against an extremely hostile environment to show their commitment to the cause of peace and racial sensitivity in the United States. Yes?
How many protesters died in Ferguson?
Many died in Ferguson. Many died in Ferguson. There were many different bombings of different houses, of different buildings, different storefronts. There was a lot of looting, there was a lot of crime. And even if not that many died at the end of the day, they were in the position where there was a very real risk to their safety. Just because someone didn't die doesn't mean that there wasn't a risk to their safety. My second example of this is Occupy Wall Street. It may be over to an extent now, but as many of those people who still followed Occupy Wall Street are still behind that movement, many were risking their lives with police officers often beating people who were in these protests, and in that sense, they were indeed risking their safety for a higher cause of activism. So, the millennials are still actively involved, indicating that activism is still alive and well. Moving to 2, lack of unity. Go back to what I said earlier, activism can be fragmented. It can be alive but fragmented. A lack of unity does not mean it is dead. They bring up the example of the LGBTQ movement, even discriminating against some others who try and join their movement. Yet in reality, I don't have my time going. Can someone check? Thanks. Even those in this movement who may push out those people who aren't part of their movement are still activists in their own right. There's no need for activism as a whole to be united in order for it to be live activism. Indeed, historically, there have been very few movements that didn't discriminate against other people. Even many people who were advocating for civil rights in the 1960s were still divisive against some other people in that movement. Therefore, we have to recognize the fact that activism can still be alive and well and still be fragmented in this sense. Looking at B, lost soul, they bring out 1, slacktivism, talk about Facebook likes and Twitter hashtags. I'm not going to deny the existence of this because I have to deal with it every day. But we also recognize the fact that while it does exist, there can be both real activism and casual activism at the same time. In other words, they are not mutually exclusive from one another. Somebody who likes something on Facebook may just do that, or they may like something on Facebook that they are also actively interested in joining a protest against. We cannot assume that that sort of scenario does not exist. The only way in which this argument would hold weight for their resolution, the only reason why this would hold weight in their resolution would be if the entire group of all protesters in the United States were doing this instead of putting themselves at risk. Not every single protester in the United States is only using Facebook likes and Twitter hashtags. Therefore, the argument flows to the opposition. And 2, attention-seeking. They bring up opponents involving Tumblr arenas. This is not necessarily a new problem. For years and years, protest has been geared towards gaining attention, even if it isn't necessarily geared towards the notion of trying to change something. So to say that activism is dead now, in part because of this reason, is not accurate. It's always been a flaw in the nature of activism, people trying to get attention by trying to take on some major flashy cause, when in reality they're not necessarily pushing the cause forward. It does not mean that real activism, pushing for real change, does not exist in a life where it is risk-seeking, or it is safety risking, and is a lifestyle as a whole. Therefore, you can vote for opposition.
No, I'm sorry. There you go.
All right, I want to start with some thank yous. Thank you to the opposition team for laying out that beautiful leader of opposition speech, and then to my partner for helping me come up with this case today. And last but not least, to the peanut gallery and the video person, Joshua. Thank you today. All right, I'm just going to go down what the opposition team and show you, Judge, and everyone on camera, why you should feel comfortable voting for the government team. Now, starting at the top of the case, we recognize that they've accepted our definitions about the fact that Batman equals activism in America and dead is operationally defiant. However, the opposition team got hung up on the definition of dead and talked about how is dead means it's not living, it's not breathing, how it can't move forward, how it will never live. But we need to recognize that because the government team recognized that dead could be, if we're applying dead to such things such as animals or plants, it will have a different definition. But the reason why we clarified the definition of dead can be seen in the criteria today, and I'll get to that. So recognize that you need to bring it back to the criteria. That's how we're truly defining dead. It's not as if we're saying that there's no heartbeat at all. So let's jump down to contention 1 and look at the criteria. How are we going to recognize that something is in fact dead and that something is activism? Now, we give you 2 ways that you'll be able to see that something is dead. First, by looking at big A, that there is no new growth. Now, the opposition team stated when talking about no new growth that it's not just the fact that there's no new growth, it's the fact that there was no possibility of any new growth. And I have 2 responses to this. Now, my first response is that there is no way that the government team can predict the future. If I could predict the future, I would not be at North Central College right now. I'd be on Wall Street doing something and rolling around in cash. Now, my second response to this is the fact that while we can't predict the future, we're showing you how, as my partner brought up in cross-examination, it's hard to revive dead things. So by showing you how activism is currently dead in the system, you can't assume that it will be dead in the future. Obviously, we're not going to be able to guarantee this 100%, but by looking at our case and by looking at the contentions and the criteria that we have outlined for you, you will be able to see that 1, activism is dead, and also, if you want to, you can cross-apply that into the future. Under big B, under contention 1, we talk about how the second criteria is this loss of soul, recognizing that when something is dead, it's not just the fact that it's not growing or not breathing, but it's a loss of soul. As you can see in our case, we're not necessarily talking about a living, breathing organism, but we're talking about more of an idea and ideologically in a movement, and because of this, we can look at the idea of a loss of soul. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to scientifically prove that all the blood is gone from activism and that it doesn't have a heartbeat, however, but we can look at the soul, the idea behind activism and the foundational values, and recognize that because it's lost this soul, it is therefore dead. So there might be factions of it still around, but it's really lost its soul, which is another type of death. So as the opposition team would like to say that this does not apply, you can see that it clearly does apply to activism. So now that we've cleared that up, we can move down to contention 2. Looking at the application, showing you, judge and audience, why that you can apply the criteria to Batman is dead, or to activism, and see how it is in fact dead. Looking at big A, activism is not growing. Now, our little 1 under this is the idea that the generation has shifted. Under little A, we talked about the older generation. Now, the opposition team got up here and they talked about how activism can be fragmented, how just because the older generation, we can't say that no one in the older generation actually is being an activist. However, 2 responses to this. The first one is that the idea behind this point is that there's no large movement by this older generation. What we're seeing here is oftentimes whenever there's a large movement by activists, that generation feels as if their work is done. As my partner brought up, there are many people that believe in the United States, but older generation, that I'll take your first of 3 questions.
Is a small movement still a movement?
Yes, what we're talking about is it dead. Specifically, is there no new growth when it comes to death? Even if there's a small movement, if that growth has decreased and is in fact declining, as we will see in the government team, then it is dead. So while there might be small fragments alive, we can see that this is not the case. Going back to my first response, looking at the idea that there is no large movement by this generation. As my partner brought up, many older people believe that we live in a post-racist society because they've accomplished things through the civil rights movement, and therefore they do not have any large movement by this generation. My second response kind of ties into the cross-examination that just happened, is that activism and a person participating in activist activities are not the same thing. As my partner brought up, talking about an activist, someone that risks their life, someone that lives their cause every single day, just like Batman. We're not talking about older people that might participate in protests, as the opposition team brought up. We're talking about people that live and breathe this every single day, and that is dead in the U.S. today. Now, moving on to the little b, when we look at the idea of millennials. Now, the opposition team brought up the idea of Ferguson and Occupy Wall Street. Now, first of all, when we look at Ferguson, the opposition team themselves talked about the violence, the looting, the crime, the chaos. Just because there was a mob of people does not mean that every single individual in that group was an activist. Furthermore, when we look at the protests in Ferguson, we can see that even if you participate in that protest, that doesn't make you an activist. You would have to be something that you're risking your life, you're living, you're breathing it every single day. It's the cause that you're living for, not just something that I'm going to go down to St. Louis for maybe a week out of the year and then go back to my home and comfortable home in Chicago, which is, for the most part, what happened in Ferguson. Now, moving down to our second point, and that's the idea of a lack of unity. Now, the opposition team brought up how they weren't sure how this actually applied, even though there's a lack of unity. They're still activists, but the big point under here is the idea that the activism isn't growing. And my partner talked about the lack of unity because the reason is these factions are no longer joining together to help one group or help one oppressed group. They're fighting with each other and having a battle about who is the lowest, who is the most oppressed. Therefore, activism is not growing. I'll take your second and third question.
Has there not always been some sort of disagreement between different minority groups over who's been more oppressed or not? And has there ever been a time in which they were all uniformly working alongside?
There's never been a time where they've been absolutely unified, and obviously there are always going to be tensions, but we've seen, as we've seen in the history and through other large activist movements that are not existing today, that people can in fact join together to set aside their differences to work for a cause. And we're not seeing this in today's system. I'll take your final question.
Can you give one example of one of those?
Once again, we're talking about the civil rights movement. We have black people, we have white people, we have Latinos, we have other people setting aside their identities and their problems, what they have, the poor people, recognizing that they're going to fight for something greater, civil rights. And moving on to big B, looking at the activism has lost its soul. And in little one, we talk about slacktivism. As we're seeing today, Facebook and hashtags, people are doing these menial activities, activist activities, but they're not activists. They're not living it. They're not risking their lives because they can just like something on Facebook or they can just use a hashtag. Under our little 2, we talked about attention seeking. Even these people that might be participating in protests or photo campaigns, 1, are not living out, but 2, they're more focused on themselves. They're more focused on bringing the attention back to themselves. So when we looked at over the case today, what we recognize is that the fact that this definition of dead, we will be able to recognize that something is dead by looking at the criteria today. And those are that there's no new growth and there's a loss of soul, which we have seen through the application today. Thank you.
Can I use your phone? Is it going to only lock on?
If it does,
I have 12% if you want to use mine.
you just press this. If it does, lock in slide.
Oh, okay, cool. I know, that's good.
Is everybody ready? All right, I'm just going to lay out a blanket of thank yous. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I love debate. It's kind of awesome that we get to do this like after the season is over. So hopefully people watching this will actually join the team because it's really fun and we need you. So, okay, I'm just going to go down the flow that it has been stood. First, I'm going to start with an observation. Now, my observation is that, first of all of the arguments that were made by the government team are based on time. When did these actions occur. While they make all these arguments that actually make it seem distorted, that there's actually other arguments going on here about how things are no longer living, my partner has already provided a lot of examples of beating activism. And that's where my second observation comes in, is that if there is a heartbeat, something is alive. So if we have one simple example of a singular protester that fights against a war, that is one example of a heartbeat. So while they provide these criteria that exist today of no new growth and loss of soul, these two criteria, which my partner had rejected in the first speech, do not stand as a counter-definition for dead. The actual definition of dead is no longer beating, aka no heartbeat. So going on to the first argument is that hold them to this idea, as my partner stated, is that the government team said that we are hung up on the idea of dead. Again, my partner explained why these criteria are insufficient, and I will explain how they are still. So going on to the argument of criteria A, no new growth. My partner stated that that they would need to entirely cut off potential for growth in order for something to be dead. The argument that the government team provided was first that there's no way that the government can predict the future, and my argument to this is no, there is actual prediction that the government team can predict, because we debate about these kinds of things all the time. What is Syria going to do? What is this kind of thing going to do? We always debate about this, so therefore we can't exactly say that they can't predict the future. And secondly, they provide this argument about talking about how they can predict that this will happen in the future, which is completely redundant and refutes their own argument. I'll take your first of three.
Is there a difference between prediction and speculation?
We're all talking about the same thing here, so it doesn't really matter. Okay, so going on to the argument about, my partner said that the idea of the loss of soul, it does not apply to activism. So while this criteria still stands, he's refuting it. He's stating that this does not apply in this case. But they keep talking about how the loss of soul in a movement equals dead. However, again, we refuted the argument, and secondly, they didn't give us anything to prove that there has been loss of soul because of the arguments that we have refuted and proven that it is still alive, which I will refute within the case continually. So going on to the contention 2 of application, which is really what's important here. First of all, the arguments that my partner made about activism can still be alive because activism can be fragmented. So while activism as a whole is not huge and not standing together, if that were the case, which it still is the case, these things can still be alive just by having fragmented activism. You don't need to have complete activism throughout the way that things used to be in the past, which is why time is the only argument that's actually making sense in this case today. But the only argument that was made is that there are no large movements. And my response to this is that there is still movement. There is still a heartbeat. And some of these are large movements. When we think of the idea of Ferguson, they cannot just refute this and say that this was not real activism because somebody decided to sit up from their chair. The exact definition that they gave us was risking your life and safety in your lifestyle. So these individuals are risking their life and safety when it comes to their lifestyle because original activists, the ones that they're talking about in time, didn't always stand outside and risk their lives every single day. They were activists that would take a seat on the couch. We can't say that people like Martin Luther King would not take a day off every once in a while as well. So we can't just demote one activist to another just because they don't stand outside one place every single day. But a lot of the activists in Ferguson did do that. So I'm going to continue on. Going into the argument about the same activists have actually been standing. The same activists that protested Vietnam are still protesting war today. This is an example of a heartbeat that has been continued on through time in a movement that is still large. While their argument to this is that they still live their everyday lives. However, again, there have been no examples given by the government team or even enough information given by the government team of what an activist is and what an activist lifestyle is. If we were to all assume that an activist lifestyle is a person that stands outside and risks their life every single day, there would be no such thing as an activist because everybody takes a day off, everybody has other lives. An activist would have to be homeless and have nothing going on for their whole entire life if they were actually all of the arguments that the government team had been making today. So going on to the argument done by the government team to what my what my partner talked about when it comes to the LGBT community, that there are still activists in their own right. While there might be some bitter battering when it comes to our activism itself, like people not actually like fighting for other causes, the argument that was made by the member of government is that it's all about who is more oppressed. However, they've only given the example of the civil rights movement of one movement that actually wasn't about arguing over who is more oppressed. Most activism is always making yourself seem like the most oppressed person because that is how you actually get the most for your movement. I will take your second of three.
And are you saying that this battle about who's at the bottom actually leads to growth?
I'm not saying that it actually. I'm saying it's not that it actually leads to growth, but it's what leads most attention to the activism, and it doesn't even matter because that's not what an activist is. We can't actually make an argument that these are less activists than other activists. I'll take a third and final question.
Okay. Can you give me a historic example of the race to the bottom?
I've only had one historic example from you, and we've given plenty of examples from today, so I don't really need to owe you anything. I'm sorry. Okay, going into the argument of historically few movements actually didn't last out against each other. They've only given the example of the civil rights movement. However, there are many examples. For example, this Vietnam idea of these people actually arguing against war. These people are not actually lashing out against other movements. This is one example of how this group existing today is a soul that is not actually lashing out against another group. There's one. Going into the activism has lost its soul, and they basically give social media as the blanket example of all of their points. As my partner stated, it does exist. Real activism is not mutually exclusive. So these things can exist. This is just a redundant argument that this is something that is happening, fluff that's going on in the status quo, like saying clouds are above our head right now, but activists still exist. And that this is not a new problem. There's always been attention given to certain issues. The only arguments that have actually been given are this is not activism. This is just photos and stuff that's receiving attention. But my argument to this is that even if this wasn't considered activism, which many people do consider this activism, it's just not activism within this case due to danger. Actually, it can. This isn't mutually exclusive. But secondly, this actually can be considered dangerous to some people. When it comes to people actually speaking out for their own sexual identity, some people in the United States are doing this within Southern cultures that are dangerous for them to do so. For example, the transsexual movement. If one person were to speak out on social media, on their Facebook, in a small area where they might not be safe for them, that is one person that is risking their life doing this by being an activist through social media. So this is also an example of somebody who in their lifestyles LGBT or is transsexual every day, is going to talk about being transsexual every day. This is in their lifestyle, and they're risking their own life because they could be putting themselves into danger just by speaking out against their own identity. So because of this, we have shown in this case, first of all, more examples, more evidence when it comes to what's more true than false. What is if activism is actually has a little bit of a beating heartbeat when we argue that it has more than that. And secondly, the case that we have been given doesn't provide many examples and isn't very strong at all because we've proven that dead does not just mean that there is no new growth. So for all of these reasons, you should feel confident in voting out.
I'm so sorry.
I forgot what
That was awful. I'm so sorry, guys. I was like yelling.
Ready? Okay, thank you everybody for an enjoyable round. I've enjoyed it a lot. It's great to be back out here debating you guys, possibly for the last time, so thank you for everything. Okay, so I'm going to give you the opposition's voting issues for this round as to why you can feel confident in voting for our team at the end of the day. There are three. The first voting issue is that of is dead. At the end of the day, when we talk about something being dead, if the government team tries to justify something is dead if there's no new growth and there's no soul attached anymore. But as my partner and I have continuously refuted, this is not sufficient enough to justify something being dead. Something is dead, and quite simply, there's no heartbeat alive for it anymore, there's no instance of it anymore. It can't just have stopped growing, because think about it, a tree can stop growing, but it can still be alive. At the end of the day, we need to recognize the fact that continual growth, new growth, and having a loss of a soul is not a justifiable enough reason to consider something's dead. If something is dead, there is no ability for it to continue to live in the future, and there is no instance of it existing in the present. The government team has not sufficiently given us reason to believe that there is not any existing anymore or that it won't reemerge in the future, whereas we have justified why it is still alive and why it will reemerge in the future. Therefore, on that reason alone, you can feel confident in voting for the opposition. Second voting issue is delaying mechanism, more true than false. Throughout the remainder of this round, the opposition team is providing more evidence and more instances wherein today there are individuals who continue to live, place themselves at risk to their safety in the effort to continue on a lifestyle of fighting for their causes. They may not stand outside of a building every single day. They may not have a career definition as an activist, which nobody really ever has. We need to recognize the fact that at the end of the day, there are still people who are fighting for these causes each and every day. We talked about Ferguson, we talked about Occupy Wall Street. As my partner brought up in her last speech, we talked about any individual transgender person who may live in a hostile environment, continue on their social media statuses to advocate for their own cause, and therefore may be placing themselves at risk. If any of these people still exist today, then activism is alive. So, our third voting issue for today is that of, the third is that the applications do not apply. So essentially first, we talk about the fact that activism is not growing, that's what they said. However, in reality, it doesn't matter if activism is necessarily growing or not, because activism can still exist, remain stagnant, perhaps remain separated, perhaps remain somewhere in the past, but at the same time, it exists. And even so, activism is still continuing to thrive here today. We talk about, first of all, their notion of how the generations are shifting. They say that the older generations are no longer interested. As my partner and I have continuously stated, there are still those individuals, for example, those who were fighting against the Vietnam War, who still continuously protest at risk to their own safety, and as part of their lifestyle, against United States military involvement abroad. Therefore, if those people exist, then clearly activism does not have no new growth based on their evidence. Secondly, they talk about the notion that millennials are not interested. This simply is not the case. There are numerous millennials for a variety of various different causes who continue to invest themselves at risk of their safety for these causes. If these people exist, activism is alive. Therefore, we can look to the second application, Big B, Lost Soul. Essentially, they talk about slacktivism and attention seeking, but as we've brought up throughout this case, there may indeed be slacktivism out there. But does that mean that there's no longer any activism? No, it does not mean that at all. They have not given us any significant reason to believe that slacktivism has encompassed the entire attitude of activism. At the end of the day, there is still risk-seeking, lifestyle activism out there that transcends the pressing of a button on Facebook or the using of a hashtag on Twitter. Therefore, activism is still alive and is indeed not dead. Additionally, when we talk about attention-seeking, activism has always had something of an attention-seeking nature that is inherent to it. That does not mean that it's lost its soul, it simply means that it's maintained part of its soul and continues to live on today. Therefore, for all of these reasons, you can feel confident in voting for the opposition.
Okay, I'd like to start off with a quick thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. I love debate. It's great to be for the recording so you can all see my beautiful face. Okay. Going on to the voting issues today, I'm going to give you our two government voting issues, and then I will cover their op voters afterwards. But there will be clash in the middle of it, so I won't cover them all. You'll see. Groovy. Going on to the voters, my first voting issue is the lifestyle activism has died. This is the key part of our definitions that me and my partner have been continually arguing and pointing back to. Activism as a lifestyle. Batman is a lifestyle. It's an everyday thing. Little a under this voting issue is the idea of not growing. And you can just see from our general criterion and the refutation under it, it's not growing. It's not growing in the same respect and size that it used to be. It's not hard to take a big picture look and see the end of the 1960s, early 1970s, and now, and see that something is missing. It's not the same. It's not growing in the same way it was. This issue of totality has come up repeatedly, and I will cover that in my second voting issue. But as we can see in the general terms of not growing, it's just simply not growing in the same way it was. It is not what it used to be. So big picture here, we're seeing that activism is not growing. This specifically can be looked to when we look at the different kinds of examples that we're given. We're talking about historic movements. They're talking about unitary current events. Ferguson and the civil rights movement are not analogous. Ferguson is one place with a couple of riot-like protests that didn't go any further. Yes?
The whole notion that historical movements like the civil rights movement and instances like Ferguson are not synonymous to one another has had the chance to be brought up before and has not been until this point.
the idea of size and difference in history was brought up mainly in her point. So I'm bringing it up here because it's the first time to directly address that style of argumentation, which was not clear in the realm prior to that. Going on. Kind of hard to do without a judge. I don't know what they want. Okay. I'm at 153.
Okay.
Okay, so as we can see here, just the difference in our evidence shows this idea. Big picture here, it's not growing. Going on to little 2 under our voting issue, or little b under our voting issue, is the idea of it being soulless. Just through our general terms, once again, this comes back to the idea of size matters, something that was continually brought up. Slacktivism and attention-seeking, yes, they've always existed to some extent, but when the movements are smaller and that same percentage exists, it becomes a bigger issue. The movements are not the same. It is dead. Lifestyle is not the same anymore. Slacktivism and attention-seeking are a much bigger deal when you're dealing with events versus causes. Going on to my second main voting issue, and this is the idea of more true than false. We're not talking about totalities here. We're not talking about literal definitions. I cannot prove to you that no one, nowhere, in no form in America is an activist. But there's a difference between a growing general movement, a lifestyle, and what's going on now. And a great way of pointing this out is looking to a quotation from the member of opposition. She says that people could not be activists with a lifestyle because then they would be homeless. They wouldn't be doing anything with their lives and they'd be going nowhere. And you're right, that's what we call hippies and yippies. People of the 1960s who did nothing but be activists. They were smelly, dirty people who lived in slums and in vacant warehouses. And they were lifestyle activists, and we don't have them in the same respect that we do today. And that simply proves the point of more true than false. We're talking about a gradient here, not black and white. And this is further shown through my 2 main points under this, which is A, that they are solitary events. These are all the evidence they're bringing up as solitary events. Ferguson, Occupy Wall Street, this or that. These are all solitary events that didn't catch on and didn't turn into long movements that lasted multiple years. They happened and then they stopped. Further, size matters. We're talking about movements versus protest events. Simply put, there's a difference in them, and there's a difference in the way that that affects what we can consider activism, lifestyle activism. Now going on to their voting issues. Their first voting issue is the idea of
Is dead in literal terms, meaning that this absolutist is absolutely dead and no longer exists.
we can't prove that, and that's abusive to make us prove. And once again, when we look at the weighing mechanism of this case, we're talking about a gradient. We are more true than false. Not absolutely true, not beyond a shadow of a doubt, more true than false, 51%. Their second point, term. As I've already stated, my own version is more true than false, so I'm not going to talk about that. And their third point, the idea of the application not applying. As I've already stated in more true than false, and throughout my refutation, the application does apply, so we must uphold that. For all these reasons, I urge a government ballot.